Don't look at me. In this house, I'm nobody. Celine's voice was a frantic whisper, her eyes glued to the tray of crystal glasses she held. But it was too late. Jang Seok-jin, the man who had torn apart every corner of Seoul looking for her, was standing in his rival's foyer, his tattooed hand trembling as it reached toward the unmistakable, heavy curve of her stomach. He wasn't looking at the glasses. He was looking at the life she had been hiding from him for 7 months. Before we reveal the secrets Celine has been keeping in the shadows of this mansion, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and turn on the notifications bell. You won't want to miss a single heartbeat of this journey. Jang Seok-jin was a king among monsters, a man whose name was synonymous with power and the dark ink that armored his skin. He had walked into Kim Dong-won's mansion expecting a cold negotiation, but instead, he found his own soul. There stood Celine, his Celine, once the queen of his world, now dressed in a cheap, starched maid's uniform. She was serving drinks to the very man who wanted Seok-jin dead. The air in the room turned to ice as 7 months of grief, anger, and unanswered questions collided with the reality of her exhaustion and her visible pregnancy. Seok-jin realized in a heartbeat that the divorce wasn't an end, it was a setup. And now he wasn't just in enemy territory, he was in a race to reclaim his family from the lion's den. The mahogany table stretched between the two men like a battlefield, laden with porcelain plates and the heavy scent of vintage wine. Kim Dong-won leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he discussed territory and shipment routes, but Seok-jin barely heard a word. Every nerve in Seok-jin's body was attuned to the soft, rhythmic sound of footsteps behind him. The door to the dining hall creaked open, and Celine stepped forward, her head bowed low. The sight of her in the crisp black and white maid's uniform felt like a physical blow to his chest. She moved with a cautious grace, one hand instinctively hovering near the underside of her belly, as if to shield her child from the very air of this room. As she reached his side to refill his glass, the scent of her, faint vanilla and cocoa butter, cut through the oppressive smell of Dong-won's expensive cigars. Seok-jin's hand tightened around the stem of his wineglass, his knuckles turning white, the tattoos on his fingers shifting with the tension. He wanted to roar, to flip the table and pull her into his arms, but he was in the heart of the enemy's fortress. One wrong move, and the men stationed at the doors would have their weapons drawn before he could reach her. "Our new girl is a bit slow," Dong-won remarked casually, his eyes darting between Seok-jin and Celine with a calculated glint. "But she's hardworking. Found her practically starving in the streets of Incheon. Can you believe it?" Seok-jin forced his face to remain a mask of stone, though his heart was thundering against his ribs. Celine's hand trembled as the wine poured, a single drop splashing on the white tablecloth. She froze. In that second, she risked a glance upward. Their eyes met, and the world outside the room ceased to exist. In her dark orbs, Seok-jin saw a lifetime of agony, the fear she had lived with for 7 months, the apology she couldn't speak, and a desperate plea for him to stay silent. She looked exhausted, the shadows under her eyes telling the story of sleepless nights spent in this den of wolves. Seok-jin wanted to tell her he was there, that he would never let her go again, but he only gave a microscopic nod, his eyes burning with a silent promise. "Wait for me." "Is something wrong, Jang?" Dong-won asked, tilting his head. "The wine," Seok-jin replied, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that made the air turn cold. "It's a bit bitter for my taste. I think it's time we wrap this up." Celine pulled back, her fingers brushing against his sleeve for a fraction of a second, a touch that felt like a brand. She turned and retreated into the shadows of the kitchen, leaving Seok-jin to face his enemy with a new, lethal clarity. He wasn't just here for a meeting anymore. He was here for a rescue. The heavy silence Seok-jin left at the dining table was the calm before a storm. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the marble floor, a sound that drew the immediate attention of Dong-won's guards. The air in here is stifling, Seok-jin spat, his voice laced with a calculated arrogance. I'm going to the gardens. Don't follow me unless you want to see if my temper has improved since the last time we traded bullets. Before Dongwon could protest, Seok-jin's Yeet enforcer, who had been waiting in the hall, accidentally knocked a heavy porcelain vase from its pedestal near the main entrance. The crash echoed like a gunshot, drawing the guard's focus and creating the narrow window Seok-jin needed. Instead of the gardens, he moved with the predatory grace of a shadow toward the back corridors, following the fading scent of vanilla. He found her in a cramped, dimly lit pantry, her back to him as she leaned against a metal prep table, her breathing ragged and shallow. She was clutching her stomach, her eyes closed in a moment of stolen rest. When the door clicked shut behind him, she spun around, a gasp dying in her throat as she saw the towering silhouette of the man she had spent 7 months trying to forget. "Seok-jin," she breathed, her voice a mix of terror and longing. "You have to leave. If Dongwon finds you here." "He's the least of your worries right now," Seok-jin growled, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He pinned her gently but firmly against the table, his hands framing her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, his eyes searching hers with a ferocity that demanded the truth. 7 months, Celine. 7 months I thought you were dead or worse. And now I find you here, carrying my child while you serve drinks to a dog like him? "I had to," she whispered, tears finally breaking free. "He would have killed you, Seok-jin. There was a coup. I thought if I disappeared, you'd be safe." "You thought wrong," he rasped, his forehead dropping to rest against hers. The anger was still there, but it was being drowned out by a wave of protective possessiveness. "You are never spending another night in this house, not as a servant, not as anything." "I can't just leave," she protested, glancing at the door. "The guards, the contracts." "I don't care about contracts," he hasped, his hand moving down to cover her swollen belly, his touch softening as he felt a faint, defiant kick against his palm. His heart stuttered. "I'm taking you home." He didn't wait for her to agree. Reaching behind her, he grabbed a heavy wool coat hanging on a peg and draped it over her shoulders, shielding her uniform and her pregnancy from view. He gripped her hand, his fingers interlocking with hers with a strength that promised he would never let go again. Leading her through a servant's exit he had mapped out minutes prior, he guided her into the cold night air, where his black sedan sat idling, a dark chariot ready to spirit the queen back to her throne. The car ride was a suffocating cocoon of silence, broken only by the hum of the engine and the shallow, uneven breaths Celine drew as she stared out the window. When the sedan finally pulled into the private underground garage of Seok-jin's high-rise penthouse, she didn't move. The familiar scent of the building, polished cedar and expensive air filtration, hit her with the force of a physical memory. Seok-jin didn't wait for the valet. He rounded the car and opened her door, his movements sharp and impatient. Yet when he reached for her hand, his touch was almost frighteningly gentle. As the private elevator ascended, Selene caught her reflection in the mirrored walls. The maid's uniform was wrinkled, her hair was escaping its tight bun, and her face was gaunt. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. When the doors opened directly into the foyer, she froze. Nothing had changed. The minimalist art they had chosen together still hung on the walls. The floor-to-ceiling windows still showcased a sprawling, indifferent soul. But as Seok-jin led her further in, the reality of her absence began to bleed through. On the marble countertop sat a small, battered plastic bag, the only thing she had brought from the servants' quarters. Seok-jin picked it up, his brow furrowed. "What is this?" "My things," she whispered, her voice cracking. He opened the bag and his face transformed into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. Inside were 2 pairs of worn socks, a cheap bottle of prenatal vitamins from a discount pharmacy, and a small, folded sonogram that was blurred from being handled too many times. There was also a tattered ledger where she had meticulously tracked every won she earned as a maid, amounts that wouldn't have even paid for one of Seok-jin's silk ties. You were living on this? Seokjin's voice was a low, dangerous vibration. He looked from the pathetic contents of the bag to the woman who had once worn diamonds as easily as breathing. I gave you everything in the settlement, Celine. I left you millions. Why were you scrubbing floors for a man like Dongwon? I couldn't touch the money, she said, her voice rising with a sudden, jagged edge of trauma. The moment I used those accounts, they would have found me. Dongwon's men told me that if I didn't stay dead to you, they would make sure you actually were. I had to become nobody, Seokjin. I had to hide in the one place they'd never look, under their own roof. A heavy, grieving silence filled the vast apartment. Seokjin dropped the bag, the cheap vitamins clattering against the expensive stone. He looked around his gilded palace and realized that while he had been mourning her in luxury, she had been fighting for survival in the dirt. He walked over to her, his shadow falling over her small frame, and for the first time, he didn't see an ex-wife who had abandoned him. He saw a survivor who was broken, and he realized with a sinking heart that his power had been the very thing that destroyed her peace. He reached out, pulling her into his chest, his tattoos pressing against the scratchy fabric of her uniform as he vowed that the gilded cage was gone. From now on, he would be her fortress. The blue glow of multiple monitors illuminated Seokjin's face, casting sharp shadows over the heavy ink on his neck as he sat in the dark sanctuary of his home office. Beside him, his lead technician tapped rhythmically on a keyboard, decrypting the final layers of a drive snatched from Dongwon's private server. Celine was asleep in the next room, finally resting on silk sheets that cost more than a year of her maid's wages. But Seokjin couldn't close his eyes. He needed to know the exact shape of the monster that had stolen 7 months of their lives. "I'm through, boss." His voice was tight. "It's a video file, dated the night before she left." Seokjin leaned forward, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The screen flickered to life, showing a younger version of himself walking toward his car, completely unaware of the 3 snipers positioned in the rafters above, their laser sights dancing like tiny red spirits over his heart and head. The camera panned slightly to reveal Celine standing just out of frame, her face pale and distorted by terror. A distorted voice echoed through the speakers, Kim Dong-won. "Sign the papers and vanish, Celine. If you stay, he dies before he reaches the driver's seat. If you tell him, he dies. If you try to take a single won from his accounts, we'll know you're active, and he dies. Choose his life or your marriage." On the screen, Seokjin watched the woman he loved collapse against a concrete pillar, her hand over her mouth to stifle a sob. She looked at him, at the man on the screen who was her entire world, and whispered a single word that didn't need audio to be understood. "Always." Then she turned and walked into the darkness, leaving everything behind to ensure he lived to see another sunrise. The video was cut to black. The silence that followed was deafening. Seokjin sat frozen, the realization washing over him like ice water. He had spent months nursing a wounded ego, hating her for a betrayal that was actually the most selfless act of devotion he had ever witnessed. She hadn't left because she didn't love him. She had left because she loved him more than she loved her own life. He stood up, his chair clattering back as a roar of grief and fury built in his throat. He looked at his hands, hands that had built an empire through fear, and realized they were clean only because she had waded through the mud in his place. He moved toward the bedroom, his steps heavy with a new, burning purpose. The war was no longer about territory or pride. It was about a debt of love he could never fully repay, and a promise that Kim Dong-won would pay for every tear she shed in the garage in blood. The heavy, clinical silence of the office was replaced by the soft, golden glow of the master suite. Seok-jin entered the room like a man walking on glass, his presence, usually so domineering, now tempered by an overwhelming sense of reverence. Celine was propped up against a mountain of pillows, her eyes tired but fixed on the window where the lights of Seoul flickered like grounded stars. She looked up as he approached, seeing not the cold mafia boss who had found her in the mansion, but the man who had once promised to cherish her. Without a word, Seok-jin sank onto the edge of the bed. The distance between them, once measured in months of silence and miles of separation, had shrunk to a few inches, yet the emotional chasm still felt vast. He looked at her stomach, the physical manifestation of the time they had lost, and felt a lump form in his throat. He reached out, his hand hovering uncertainly in the air, the dark tattoos on his knuckles standing out against the white linen. "Can I?" he asked, his voice a low, vulnerable rasp. Celine nodded slowly, taking his hand and guiding it to the center of her bump. For a long moment, there was nothing but the heat of her skin and the steady thrum of her heart. Then it happened. A sharp, rhythmic thud against his palm, a tiny, defiant greeting from the life they had created. Seok-jin froze, his eyes widened, and for the first time in years, the mask of the underworld king crumbled completely. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the side of her belly, his shoulders shaking with a silent, jagged sob. It wasn't just a kick, it was a reminder that despite the shadows, the blackmail, and the blood, something pure had survived. It was the first time he had truly felt like a father, and the weight of that responsibility was more terrifying and beautiful than any war he had ever fought. "I didn't know," he whispered into the fabric of her gown. "I didn't know how much I was missing." Celine's fingers drifted to his hair, her touch hesitant at first before settling into a familiar, soothing stroke. The tension that had lived in her spine since the night in the parking garage began to ebb away. "She's a fighter, Seok-jin," Celine said softly, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "Just like you." In that quiet room, surrounded by the luxury that once felt like a cage, the air finally cleared. The anger and the suspicion were replaced by a fragile, burgeoning hope. As they sat there, counting the kicks together in the dim light, the mafia boss vanished, replaced by a man who realized that his greatest empire wasn't the city outside the window, it was the heartbeat beneath his hand. The golden warmth of the bedroom felt like a fleeting dream as Seok-jin stepped back into the cold, clinical light of his war room. The sonogram of his daughter was tucked safely into his breast pocket, resting against his heart, but his eyes were once again the flinty, frozen pools of a man ready for slaughter. He had spent the last hour cross-referencing the timestamp of the blackmail video with his own security logs from 7 months ago. The realization had settled in his gut like lead. Kim Dong-won couldn't have positioned those snipers in a private high-security garage without inside help. The codes, the blind spots, the timing, it was an invitation from within. "Move her," Seok-jin commanded, his voice a low vibration that made his subordinates stiffen. "The mountain estate. No electronics, no external staff. Use the secondary convoy, and if a single person outside this room knows her location, I'll personally ensure they never see the sun again." He watched the monitors as Celine was ushered into a nondescript SUV, wrapped in his own heavy cashmere coat. She looked back at the penthouse windows, her expression a mix of trust and lingering trauma. He waited until the tail lights vanished into the Seoul fog before turning to his inner circle, 6 men who had bled for him, men he had called brothers. The air in the room grew heavy, the oxygen seemingly sucked out by Seok-jin's suffocating aura. He didn't yell, he simply began to pace, the sound of his leather shoes like the ticking of a countdown. 7 months ago, a woman was forced to choose between my life and her dignity, he began, his voice dangerously smooth. He stopped behind his most trusted lieutenant, Park, a man who had been with him since the street gang days. Seokjin placed a heavy hand on Park's shoulder, his thumb tracing the line of the man's jugular. She lived in a cellar while I sat on a throne. She worked for a dog like Dongwon while I mourned her. He leaned down, whispering into Park's ear. Tell me, Park, how much did Dongwon pay you to turn off the cameras in the North Garage? Was it enough to buy a soul? The silence that followed was deafening. Park's breath hitched, a microscopic tremor in his hands betraying him. In the world of the Black Rose, a tremor was a confession. Seokjin didn't wait for an answer. With a sudden, explosive movement, he gripped the back of Park's mech and slammed his head into the reinforced glass of the map table. The glass didn't shatter, but the sound of the impact echoed like a final judgment. You didn't just betray me, Seokjin rasped, his face inches from the traitors. You targeted a pregnant woman. You targeted my blood. He signaled to the remaining guards. Take him to the basement. I want everything he knows about Dongwon's next move. Then erase him. As they dragged the screaming man away, Seokjin didn't feel the triumph of a king. He felt the crushing weight of a man who realized that the walls of his empire were made of sand. He turned back to the window, looking toward the mountains where Celine was hiding. He was the lion of the den, but he was beginning to realize that to truly protect her, he would have to burn the den to the ground. The mountain estate was a fortress of cedar and stone, isolated from the neon pulse of Seoul and the rot of the syndicate. Outside, the wind howled through the ancient pines, but inside, the fireplace crackled with a warmth that felt like a sanctuary. Seokjin sat on the floor at Celine's feet, his back against the sofa, as she ran her fingers through his dark hair, untangling the knots of tension that had lived there since the night at the mansion. For a few hours, the war with Dongwon didn't exist. The traitors had been purged, and the perimeter was secure. On the low table between them lay a notebook filled with scribbled names, a mix of Korean tradition and Celine's heritage. I don't want him to carry the weight of my name, Seokjin whispered, his voice uncharacteristically soft as he watched the firelight dance across the room. He reached back, his hand finding hers. The name Jang in this city is a shadow. It's a warning. I want something different for him. I want a name that sounds like the morning, not the night. Celine leaned forward, her belly resting against his shoulder. Then we give him a name that means light or peace. She traced the line of a tattoo on his forearm, a dragon that had once symbolized his ferocity, now just ink on a man tired of fighting. But it's not just about a name, Jin. It's about the world he wakes up in. He can't grow up behind bulletproof glass. Seokjin turned, looking up at her with an intensity that made her breath hitch. He won't. I've already started the process. The Black Rose, it's a parasite. I'm cutting it out. I'm liquidating the shipping lines, the clubs, the high-interest loans. Everything that smells of blood is being sold or buried. It's dangerous to leave, isn't it? She asked, her eyes searching for him. It's more dangerous to stay, he replied firmly. He stood up, moving to sit beside her, his hand coming to rest on her stomach, where their son was currently quiet, perhaps listening to the future being carved out for him. I spent my life building a throne of thorns just to realize I'd rather be a commoner with you. Let the syndicate rot. Let Dongwon have the scrap metal. I'm taking my wealth, my men who are actually loyal, and I'm building something clean, a legacy he can be proud to tell his friends about. He leaned in, kissing her forehead, then the tip of her nose, before whispering a name against her lips, a name that was soft, melodic, and entirely untainted by the underworld. Dae-hyun, he murmured, great honor, but the kind of honor you earn with your heart, not your fists. Celine smiled, a tear of relief finally escaped. In that quiet mountain air, the Black Rose withered and died, replaced by the fragile, beautiful hope of a man who was finally brave enough to be ordinary. The peace of the mountain estate was shattered at 3 a.m. with the rhythmic thud of rotor blades and the sharp, percussive crack of flashbangs echoing through the valley. Kim Dong-won had found them. He hadn't come for a negotiation or a territory settlement. He had come to erase the only leverage Seok-jin had left. The bedroom door burst open as Seok-jin entered, his chest bare, a tactical vest cinched over his tattoos. He looked like the monster he had tried to bury, but his eyes were frantic with a very human fear. He reached for Celine, who was already sitting up, gasping as a wave of agony rolled through her, not from the terror outside, but from within. "Jin?" She choked out, her hand clutching the edge of the mattress, her knuckles white. "Something's wrong. It's too early." As a second explosion rocked the foundation of the house, sending dust raining from the ceiling, a warm rush of fluid soaked the silk sheets. Celine's eyes widened, a different kind of scream building in her throat. "Jin, my water broke! Now! He's coming now!" Seok-jin felt the world split in two. Outside, the sounds of suppressed gunfire and the shouts of his loyal men signaled the breach of the perimeter. Inside, the woman he had fought 7 months to reclaim was entering a battle of her own. He dropped to his knees beside her, grabbing her hand even as he checked the magazine of the pistol on the nightstand. "Listen to me," he rasped, his voice a low, steady anchor amidst the chaos. "The walls are reinforced. My best men are at the door. You are not doing this alone." A bullet shattered the reinforced glass of the outer balcony, but the heavy curtains held the shards. Seok-jin didn't flinch. He used his body as a shield, pressing Celine back against the pillows. Every time a muffled blast shook the room, he squeezed her hand harder, whispering promises of a life they hadn't lived yet. "Push, Celine," he urged, his voice competing with the roar of a car engine crashing through the estate gates below. "Ignore the noise. Focus on me, just me." The irony was a jagged blade in his heart. He was a man of death, surrounded by a war of his own making, while trying to usher a new life into the world. Between her guttural cries and the metallic scent of gunpowder drifting through the vents, Seok-jin realized that his past and his future were colliding in blood. He fired a single warning shot toward the door as a shadow passed the hallway, never letting go of Celine's hand. He was fighting a war on 2 fronts, one with lead and steel, and the other with a love so fierce it threatened to consume him. In the darkness of the mountain, amidst the fire and the fury, the legacy of the Black Rose was dying, and a father was being born. The bedroom door shuddered under the weight of a final desperate kick from the hallway, the wood splintering near the hinges. Outside, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and iron, and the muffled shouts of Kim Dong-won's men grew closer. Seok-jin stood by the threshold, his pistol raised, his finger a fraction of a millimeter from the trigger. He could hear Dong-won's voice, venomous and arrogant, ordering his men to bring him Seok-jin's head. But then, a sound from the bed cut through the violence like a blade of pure light. Celine let out a high, broken cry, her body arching in the final throes of labor. "Jin, he's here! I can't do this alone!" Seok-jin looked at the door. He knew that if he stepped into that hallway, he could end Kim Dong-won forever. He could put a bullet between the eyes of the man who had tormented his wife, destroyed his peace, and tried to kill his unborn child. Every instinct honed by years in the Black Rose screamed at him to finish the job, to be the monster the world expected him to be. Then he looked back at Celine. She was trembling, her face slick with sweat and tears, her hand reaching out into the empty air for a support that wasn't there. At that moment, the Mafia boss died. Seok-jin lowered his weapon, the heavy steel clattering onto the floorboards, a sound of surrender, not to his enemy, but to his humanity. He turned his back on the door and the man who wanted him dead, and he ran to the bedside. "I'm here," he whispered, his voice thick with a sudden, overwhelming grace. He slid behind her on the bed, pulling her back against his chest, his tattooed arms becoming a cradle. I'm not going anywhere. Look at me, Celine. Just me. As the first heavy boot hit the bedroom door, Seok-jin didn't reach for his gun. He reached for Celine's hand. Outside, the sound of a heavy tactical team, his own reinforcements, erupted in the hallway, the tide of the battle finally turning. But Seok-jin didn't care about the victory. He was focused on the small, wet cry that suddenly filled the room, a sound more powerful than any explosion. The baby was placed onto Celine's chest, a tiny, shivering miracle covered in the evidence of their struggle. Seok-jin leaned down, his tears falling onto Celine's shoulder as he watched the infant take his first, gasping breath. Dong-won was gone, fleeing into the night as the authorities closed in, but Seok-jin didn't feel the need to chase him. The priority had shifted. The empire was gone, and in its place was a tiny heartbeat that demanded a father, not a king. He closed his eyes, breathing in the scent of new life and the woman who had saved him twice, knowing that the real war was finally over. 5 years later, the morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of a modest coastal villa, far from the suffocating steel of Seoul's skyscrapers. There were no armed guards at the doors, no whispered secrets in the hallways, only the sound of a young boy's laughter as he chased a golden retriever across the sand. Jang Seok-jin stood on the terrace, a cup of coffee in his hand, his sleeves rolled up to reveal tattoos that now felt like relics of a past life. The journey from the Black Rose to this quiet shore had been the hardest war he ever fought. It was a transition that required more than just money. It required the dismantling of a man who believed power was a weapon to be wielded. As Celine walked out to join him, leaning her head against his shoulder, the silence between them was no longer filled with the ghosts of Dong-won or the shadows of a forced divorce. Their story serves as a profound reflection on the nature of true strength. For years, Seok-jin believed his power was measured by the fear he instilled in his enemies, while Celine believed her strength lay in her ability to suffer alone, to save the man she loved. But their path back to one another revealed a vital truth. Leaving to protect someone is often a beautiful misconception. Real protection doesn't grow in the dark or in isolation. It flourishes when two people face the world's threats as a single, unified front. By choosing to drop his weapon in that mountain estate, Seok-jin didn't lose his throne. He traded a temporary empire for a permanent legacy. He chose the human over the boss, proving that the greatest authority a man can hold is the trust of his family. Celine, too, learned that her value wasn't as a martyr, but as a partner. Their reconciliation reminds us that while external forces can manipulate us into separation, the courage to be vulnerable and the willingness to change are what ultimately sustain a happily ever after. True power is not found in the blood you spill, but in the peace you are willing to build for those who hold your heart. As the sun rose higher, painting the ocean in shades of gold, Seok-jin looked at his wife and son and realized that he had finally found what he was searching for. He wasn't a king anymore, and he had never been more powerful. If you believe Seok-jin made the right choice by choosing his family over his throne, comment legacy below. Subscribe for more stories of love that defy the odds. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.